Okay, so it's a real pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Susan Tsang. Now, Susan works as a private consultant through their scientific consultancy, Biodiversitas Global. Susan is also a research associated at the American Museum of Natural History and the National Museum of the Philippines. Her consultancy work focuses on providing expertise on and addressing illegal wildlife trade, disease ecology, and other sustainable development challenges that we face on a global scale. As a researcher, her primary interests are in the evolution and biogeography of Southeast Asian flying foxes, the world's largest bats. This has led her to work with some of the most threatened bat species, and really some of the most poorly known bat species as well. So along with her Southeast Asian colleagues, she's carried out conservation work both at the community and transnational levels. Some of her ongoing projects in Indonesia, for example, focus on local empowerment for reducing bat hunting. Now, Susan serves as the steering committee of the Southeast Asian Bat Conservation Research Unit and the Global Union of Bat Diversity Networks. And is also a member of the IUCN Bat Specialist Group and the Global Bat Taxonomy World Group. So today, Susan will be talking to us about flying fox hunting and trafficking in Southeast Asia. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Susan take over. Thank you, Susan. I'm really looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you for the introduction. Let me just set this up in 1 second. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Yes. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks again for the introduction, and I'm happy today to be here to talk about flying fox hunting and trafficking in Southeast Asia. So hunting is one of the, okay, there we go. Hunting is one of the greatest immediate threats to endangered species in Southeast Asia. There have been sharp declines in many of the populations of not only endangered taxa, but even very common species since the 1970s, when you see this rapid development happening in many, many countries. And there's a lot more industrialization of things like deforestation. And it results in what's called empty forest syndrome. You see this especially in places like Vietnam, when people are looking in national parks, for instance, and there are like no rhinos in there, despite that being the purpose of having formed that national park in the first place. And just the functional definition of wildlife trafficking, just based on my experience in fish and wildlife, and also how generally speaking it's covered in most countries, is that there's wildlife involved and there's border crossing, and when it crosses it illegally because you don't have the right permits, but also you did it because you're smuggling something, that counts as wildlife trafficking. So it's not always the really obvious things that people think of are trafficking. There's also other smaller and more minor infractions that actually do count as trafficking. However, a lot of the problems lay with the fact that we don't have a lot of data because of the fact that it's academically been recognized so recently as a issue. The overhunting that's happening has only been recently addressed specifically by a paper that was released like 5 or 6 years ago that said that we need more research on this, and very few people have really pivoted towards working on it. And most of that data focuses on some of the species that we know globally are the most overhunted species. So tigers, in general, big cats getting like tiger bones, and also things like apes in terms of the pet trade, or rhinos for ivory and things like that. So those types of problems are pretty well known, but for lesser known taxa like bats, you really don't see that same type of attention. You don't even see that for other species that now we recognize are highly trafficked, but we didn't have the evidence for them beforehand. So there's not a lot of attention, for instance, from people who do research on things like saigas, but there's more interest on the law enforcement side. So most of our data has very much been based on what we've been able to capture. And that capture is based on most of what we know from the trafficking value chain. So most of the time when we talk about the trafficking value chain, it's between countries because we're talking about transnational trade. But at the same time, that can just be simplified to be what happens between the steps of supply, transit, and demand. So the flow of products, and at any point that happens, a lot of those steps and people involved are places where interventions could happen, but you can't even do any of that unless you know them. So that's where a lot of the research can come in and help us understand them better and have us be able to go and solve the problem so that it's going to protect wildlife. So how can we really address these issues? In the supply side, you can really go towards increasing political will, which is things like on a local level, getting support, on a national level, and getting a law made, and a national level, signing multilateral agreements. You can increase level of enforcement, and that can be either through the presence of law enforcement officers or even through local patrols and community patrols, anything that increases the presence to enforce the laws that exist, and just improve rule of law in general. So rule of law is not just a question of governance, but it's also doing things like improving criminal investigation or prosecution or sentencing. And for instance, those types of functions are what Fish and Wildlife train people to do. Whereas for us as researchers, we might be doing it by helping support prosecution by providing them with a report that says, this is what this actually means when we take the scientific evidence. On the demand side, you can actually try and understand why is it that people are consuming the wildlife in the first place. And then you can increase consumer awareness of the impact that this hunting is having and create activities to directly impact consumer behavior. So in Indonesia, which is where I'm going to focus most of my talk today on, where we've done the most work on hunting, all over the entire country, you have this type of hunting happening. And it's just a little map for anybody who's not familiar with Indonesia. But on different places, people hunt bats for different reasons. So in Sumatra and Java, you see a lot of people hunting the flying foxes because they want to eat the liver as a medicine. It's considered a traditional medicine for asthma. And in Borneo, in Sulawesi, and Papua, you see people eating them more for food. In Sulawesi, which is where we're going to talk about today, that's where it's the highest and the extreme market and the high volumes of sustenance are coming in. And in the Lesser Sundas and Maluku, even these like small islands, you see people consuming them, but it's not as common, and people tend to be eating them as like snacks when they're doing drinking parties or hanging out with people. So that volume is not as high. And you have a lot of people who hunt bats in very different ways. So the upper left picture is actually at a bat roost where you have these poles that are all around the roost, and they'll put a fishing line along the top of the poles, and then they have hooks on them so that when the bats are emerging or when they're coming back to the roost, they will get stuck on these lines. And the bottom left, you see that there is a fisherman that comes at about dawn, and he comes down, lowers the poles, and then he just takes the bats off and then dispatches them with blunt force trauma. And on the right side, this is from Sumatra, but you also see this in Java where people will fly kites, and the kites will be used to fly up next to the bat and run it into the bat so that they can cause the bat to crash basically, and then they go pick up the bat. And this is done not very commonly. It's actually a very localized, like father-son hunting tradition kind of thing. But you do still see people doing that pretty often in certain parts of Sumatra and Java. So yeah, like I said, we're going to focus on Sulawesi. That's where most of my work has been. And again, this is I think a lot of people have seen these pictures before because there's been more attention that's been paid to bat hunting in Sulawesi compared to other places. And it's often used as this, photos from here anyway, are often used as a way to say like, oh, bat hunting is really, really high. But really, it's especially in Sulawesi where we have to focus that attention. It's not consistently at this volume everywhere else, even though it is quite high compared to some other commonly known species. And there's other rare animals that are being sold there too. So we've seen black-crested macaques there before. We've seen something that's been just labeled forest rodents, and those can vary anywhere from actual rodents to even cuscus, which is on the right here. Cuscus are endemic marsupials. Well, at least for Sulawesi, their own endemic species. And then there are also other sister species in Australia and Papua New Guinea and things like that. But cuscus are pretty big, so it's very hard to mistaken them as rodents, but people can't really differentiate, so they call everything like forest rodents sometimes. So we have this extreme market that really attracts a lot of attention. It's in like every single guidebook that you find whenever there's like a travel to Sulawesi thing. And even when you go to the hotels, they will tell people about it and say, oh, it's a tourist destination. But it's something that obviously I would not support anybody going to. And I have tried to get these guidebook sites to remove it from their listings, and some of them haven't, some of them haven't. So you'll find out like Lonely Planet, for instance, even though it really is not this type of thing that is very good for any sort of person that actually likes animals. And a lot of the work that we did is from a collaboration between myself and my Indonesian student, Sarah. And we really focus on understanding how these networks of bushmeat markets operate and where is it that they actually get their sourcing from. So it's very, very targeted in this upper northern province in Sulawesi. So if you zoom in on that province, it's actually broken down into regencies, and those regencies each have their own markets and their own hubs, basically. And there are a lot of people that will tell us, like, there's so many bats in the market. From other places. And sometimes when people tell you that they think that there's still bats in North Sulawesi, it's not actually from North Sulawesi. It's from Gorontalo, which is the province next to North Sulawesi, but you really don't see it like in North Sulawesi proper. There's a group in North Sulawesi that are a tribe called Minahasan people, and the Minahasan people are the ones that are driving some of this consumption. And actually, we know that. So this study was done years ago now, not that many, but enough, where we now also know, besides Kalimantan, we're also getting bats coming in from the Lesser Sundas, and so it's not really limited to just Sulawesi. Now it's slowly expanding to many of the other islands, and it's going to start impacting bat populations and species that are not necessarily the ones that are from Sulawesi, but we can't always really tell because the bats that you would find in the market are often burned already. So all the things that you would use for diagnostic characters, like forearm length or the mantle coloration or any sort of external features, are just completely burned off. So it's really difficult to tell. And obviously, because it's cooked, it's harder to tell with trying to get a fresh tissue sample and using DNA. So a lot of these problems stem from the fact that most people eat them as part of a celebration. And it's because people in Minahasa are not Muslim, they are Christian. And they use it as a way to separate themselves and as an identity marker. And so there's a dense concentration of Christians that are in North Sulawesi. And this is actually a relic of the colonial culture. So this is a place where there are actually a lot of Dutch colonists, and it's a trusted institution because of that. And they're extremely Christian, to the point where when Indonesia was looking for independence, these guys in this province try to also stay with the Dutch instead of actually joining Indonesia. But, obviously the Dutch were like, no thanks. So they're still part of Indonesia, but they really, really don't treat themselves as if they're the same types of people. And so they really have a very odd type of vibe to it when you go there from the rest of Indonesia, because every like 600 meters or so when you're driving down the road, you'll see a church. And a lot of the older folks in there are very much invested in that religious culture. But at the same time, the church is an institution that if we use them properly as conservation biologists, they can actually act as enforcers and educators because they are so trusted in the community. And these peaks really happen during specific times of year. Since I said it's a celebration. So usually during the holidays, you have these really big spikes from the entire community, but you also see minor spikes during minor Christian holidays also. And the church itself might not be able to stop everything completely, but at the same time, having those dialogues with them so that they can encourage their parishioners to eat fewer bats is at least some way to try to stop the speed at which it's happening. And that's, in the short term, the best we can really do for now. So from what we know in terms of our other more recent work and surveying some of these other parts of Sulawesi about where exactly is it that the bats come from, a lot of these bats are coming from South Sulawesi. And so they are from these really, really large roosts that people have known about for many, many years. So for instance, in red here is Sinjai, over here, and also Baru. And that's close to Sopeng, which is a city that has a huge bat roost in the city proper and is actually protected. So you can have these places that sometimes are very close to one another geographically, but have very different attitudes about how they treat the bats. And a lot of the places that people have said that there might have been bat roosts that we checked, there's actually none of them. So for instance, in Tanah Toraja, which is a very big tourist site, you don't really see any of the flying fox roosts at all. And we don't really know why is it exactly that we don't find them there. So in taking our value chain model and putting in what we know that the hunters on the supply side are very local folks, and they usually do not actually get a lot of money, but per bat, they get paid something like about 8,000 Indonesian rupiah, which is about 50 US cents. And they usually sell it to a local middleman, and the local middlemen are the ones who bring it to the markets. And that can be the local middleman bring it to even more centralized middleman that's actually coming from North Sulawesi and contracting all of these local guides to find hunters for them. And the middlemen from North Sulawesi then bring it to these hubs in the market where they distribute the bats to be sold by the vendors. And then the vendors themselves are the ones that will sell it to the consumers in North Sulawesi. And as you go down that value chain, you see the increase in price. So the increase in price is about 10 times. And generally speaking, you will actually not only find this in the extreme market now, but also even in the regular supermarket. So if you go into Manado, which is the capital in North Sulawesi, you will actually see there's a section in the back, like the deli meats, where they also sell bats. And that pricing is about the same, maybe like a little bit more expensive, but not by very much. So we have to actually understand what's going on. And the only way that we can do that is by having ourselves look at, what we can do and apply theory of change. So for those who are not familiar, theory of change is when you take a framework that is guiding the community engagement and use it to help change policy and guide practitioners about what they can do. And usually the 4 pathways that we usually talk about are disincentives for illegal behavior, incentives for wildlife stewardship, decreased costs of living with wildlife, and supporting livelihoods unrelated to wildlife consumption. And generally, when we look at the question of disincentives, we're actually talking about creating a stronger legal framework. And for the other 3, we're looking at conservation actions that are more effective if you are actually able to go out and understand those communities first. And that's where a lot of outreach activities often fail, is that they don't actually have a clear understanding of the local community and what they actually want. So the things that are done are not necessarily targeted to solve the problems that are out there. So community action is really necessary as part of it. You need to get local community support and really help them nurture a sense of ownership to create better governance and create action. And this is an example of when we convened a group of people from North Sulawesi who are not only students who are interested in a question and lecturers from the academic community, but also folks who work at NGOs that are not just conservation NGOs, but also like rescue centers and other ones that deal with wildlife, not only in bats, but they have a strong interest in bats. And that community dialogue also happens when we go out and talk to the people in the villages. So you have the district government, the village government, you have fishermen who go out and they see these bat roosts, you have farmers who are impacted by having bats around their orchards, you have village reps who represent the interests of the locals, and you even have like nature clubs and youth organizations that are interested in this question now, because nature clubs are often nature lovers who also like to go hiking and bring people out and like experience nature. And a lot of young people are very concerned about environmental issues. And you can really leverage that and look at these factors that are not paid attention to. So for instance, we actually work a lot more with women than some of these other governments often pay attention to them. And that's because the 3 of us who work on this are women. And, we know that there's a big blind spot whenever people are dealing with conservation issues and trying to get people to become empowered and act. And this is often through the fact that nobody is even engaging with them at all. So we went out as just individuals before we formed our local NGO Progress. Progress is actually an acronym, but we'll just call it that in English. And it really looks at the fact that women are the key holders to waste management and family health. So when they talk about things like, what do we eat for dinner? Or what is it that I can do so that my children can have a future where we're not looking at environmental pollution and affecting their health in some way? Like, women are the ones who control a lot of the conversation about that in the family, but nobody is really targeting them as an actor who can actually help and do something about it. So one thing that is really important with flying foxes is really providing roost protection. And this is something that is just as simple as increasing our presence on the ground. So having a patrol that goes out every other week, for instance, on our part, was a way for not only monitoring the bat population, but also just making it known that there is somebody who goes out there pretty regularly. And that discourages people from breaking the law, which is a good way to help support local laws that are being made, and community laws, which we call adat in Indonesia. They are something that the village chief can enforce, and they are something that, because we have people there, they know it's enforced. And we actually built a little watchtower so that if we have people that are going out onto those islands and have to stay for extended periods of time to monitor the bats, then they can just stay in the watchtower. And there's actually a good view from the watchtower to the colony that if you look at the telescope that we have on there, you can count the bats very clearly even. And that's helped us really create a lot more community partnership and more buy-in from people. that normally would not really pay very much attention to this problem. And from this roost protection, you've seen a decrease in hunting activity to the point where we have had no hunting activity since the beginning of our program officially with Progress. And you've seen an increase in the bat population from very few bats, like sub 10,000, and usually kind of more about the few hundred, to 35,000 at max at some points in the year, because these bats are a little bit seasonal, where they will fly around different parts of Sulawesi according to food availability. And you actually have not just the original bat species that we aim to protect, which is Pteropus griseus, the gray flying fox, but also the other two more common species, Pteropus electo, the black flying fox, and Acerdon salabensis, the Sulawesi flying fox. And that's because it's recognized as a site that basically has less disturbance and is a very safe place for them to be. There's actually plenty of trees on the island they roost on. And now all these bats are really coming together and coalescing also in this space. And the populations are growing just overall when we went out and we counted like specifically the endangered population, the endangered species that we're looking at. And you also have, like I said, a lot of community buy-in. And so they have more sustainable development plans and they want to actually grow towards ecotourism. So they've done things like beach cleaning. And this is a photo from when some of the youth groups also helped with that beach cleaning and helped lead putting up signs and like helping with greening in general. And you have greening projects that are more localized to households even, where we are bringing native plants and teaching people about what native plant species should be there and helping them plant community gardens and help green like the fronts of their houses. And then we also help create an information board in the village where we not only post updates about the research that people are doing, but monitoring bat population, having just a standard informational plaque about what's going on with the bats. And I've talked to a lot of people after that where they've said like they found this information board very helpful. And, you know, from the scientific side, we can also really help encourage ecological research. So things like collecting pollen and really doing ecosystem service research is really helpful. And it also is a way for us to get out there and bring young people who are interested in doing science and teaching them techniques and, you know, actually learning about the scientific process and not just seeing other people do it and just, you know, taking data from them. And the other thing we really need to know actually more about is their reproductive cycle, which we have mostly based on what we know from other places, but because the climatic conditions in Sulawesi are different, we don't know how closely they trend to what's going on elsewhere. So we really do need to do more of that type of research in order to get a better grasp on it. On top of that, you have this very specific association between flying foxes and a lot of different plant species, especially those that are economically and ecologically important. So the economically important species in Southeast Asia, at least for here, is durian, which is the big fruit that's spiky and smells a lot. Like people don't like it, but I love it. And so do a lot of Indonesians. It's very culturally important also. You have a lot of ecologically important species like the fig trees and a lot of native species that are important to forming that forest and maintaining a connected plant community. We did this by looking at pollination exclusion experiments. So this is actually from Sarah's master's research, where, you know, she climbed up these trees and she set up exclusion experiments where it omitted the bats from being able to go into those flowers. And then there were some that were open where it's a little bit more difficult, and you can see the setup for them. The little arrows here are pointing at where the insects can still get at it. And these are extremely obvious once they actually flower because the durian are big. So you'll see how large and spiky they are on the trees as they grow. And so we counted fruit set when that happens. And in general, you'll see that there's a higher fruit set of durian associated with visitation by flying fox. So on the bottom two here are the two native flying foxes, Pteropus electo and Acerdon salabensis. And on top there is another smaller pteropod, Eonycteris spelaea. Eonycteris spelaea is the species that a lot of people know to be associated with durian because of the studies in Thailand where they are the main pollinator. But from our work, we actually know that while Eonycteris spelaea is also pollinating these durian flowers, it actually does better when it has the big bats also come in and actually come in first in order to open those flowers, because the big bats crash into the durian flowers and it opens the flowers up and it also gets it all over their face and like, you know, go to the next one. And so they're just more effective at holding higher pollen loads. And taking that information, we can then go out and talk to the community with a poster that we made about, you know, durian, and that helps make people think of durian first and then understand that the bats are part of that process. And so they include the bats in terms of thinking of like, wow, if I love durian, I need to protect bats, but also just the information that we get related to durian and the ecosystem services is something that we can then bring to policymakers and communicate with them that this is economically important. So even in our little area in Sulawesi, in central Sulawesi, we have a valuation of the amount of ecosystem services that a bat provides at around $450,000. And that's just from our one area in central Sulawesi where we work. So that's not even counting for everywhere else, where there might be higher concentrations of forests, and in some cases, other parts of central Sulawesi have even larger flying fox colonies. So this is something that we can then target for how we are doing our outreach. And then we go out there and working with a lot of these youth communities and also with nature lovers groups. We can actually train them in not only working with bats, but also even just other professional development skills like project management and also finances and things like making organic fertilizer and helping other people, because these are things that they're interested in, not only for this project specifically, but as job skills in general, in order to make them more competitive. And it's not something that they have access to in their normal education or even through the normal channels. And that's just because the area that we work in is pretty remote. And so it's pretty difficult to get some of these expertise and people out there who do that, aside from maybe a handful of bureaucrats that are coming in from Java. And they don't really work with a lot of the people on the village level. They're very concentrated in the very few cities that are there. In improving the legal capacity, we started these workshops and dialogues in order to share information between parties about hunting. And so here is not just people from the community, but also we have folks who are from LIPI, which is the national research arm of the Indonesian government. So the Indonesian Institute of Sciences, LIPI, is my collaborator also for my research, and they are part of the Southeast Asian Bat Conservation Research Unit. So they're happy to participate and also contribute to this. And that way we can also put everybody together in one place to talk about how urgent these threats are and what types of research and conservation programs are really needed. And from that, we can then know who are the actors and then train the local universities who are doing the data collection to go out there and be able to actually help us understand what's going on presently. From these workshops, we have a list of known flying fox roost sites and hunting locations. So the little map I showed you before was only for one little area in Southeast Sulawesi, but also these folks from all over, and so they can talk about and contribute to everything going on all over the place. And then we can bring that information to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And the list of current flying fox and research and conservation programs allows us to then understand who our potential partners could be with each other, as folks who are working on this problem, and also to understand in those places what has worked and what hasn't worked. And so we get more information aside from just our own little pilot study in our little area, but also more information from everybody else. And all the participants gain a better understanding of how severe bushmeat hunting is and the importance of flying foxes. And not a lot of people know about flying foxes in general, so they don't know that they're strongly associated with these things that people are trying to achieve also with protecting the forest and maintaining forest health. But a lot of people also don't realize how severe the hunting is if they don't really see it in the first place. Bats are, nocturnal for the most part, and if there's nobody really looking at these colonies all the time, they don't really understand that they're slowly being depleted. And on top of that, because the bats are all coalescing only at the bushmeat market, these sourcing areas don't know that that volume is higher than just their little part of Sulawesi. The village chiefs also learn a lot about the species. A lot of them don't have backgrounds in science, and so this is sometimes the first exposure that they have to environmental education also. And they've actually often, become very enthusiastic about conservation, not just for flying foxes, but also for other things. And they commit to actually creating more local laws, basically, and regulations. So formalizing hunting bans through the village level. And then also just helping them promote community-based conservation. So they are then actively thinking about what are the types of problems that we're dealing with that we're also seeing out there? What is it that we can have other people come in and research and understand better and take data for? From the university students, they learn about research and conservation of the bats, but also they have an opportunity to work together with different stakeholders that they otherwise would not have any access to. So for instance, you don't normally have a very local university's students be able to talk to people who are working at LIPI, because normally there's very few LIPI folks, and also normally LIPI is dealing with these very national level issues sometimes, and then the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, there's only the units that are localized to those specific areas, then they might not even patrol to their area because it's so local, except for like once every 2 months. And so this is a really good way for them to meet each other, and then they can just WhatsApp each other from now on instead of, hoping somebody responds to a letter that they sent to the office. And all of this is hinged on this understanding of theory of plant behavior also. So we want people to stop eating bats, right? And this is actually modified from something that Tega published a few years ago, just about the general understanding of bats and hunting and people eating them. And what we're going to really focus on is this question about beliefs and motivations that are getting people to eat bats, and this attitude of eating bats as being good. And so we're using our outreach to try to target that because we understand those aspects of our system well, since we've actually done more work in them. So the first thing that we did was actually take information on bats and other basic environmental education out to young children. And that's something that we know is a big missing component from their education. So these kids range from, like kindergarten level up to like middle school. So it's like 5 or 6 years old to like 14-ish. And the particular study that we did with Tasikoki Wildlife Rescue, which was done by Wendy Leon Bukit, was to go out to these 4 schools in the largest bushmeat market districts in North Sulawesi. So all of these places, Manado, Tomohon, Langkawan, and Kawankawan, they are all places with the large hubs I showed you in the map earlier on in this talk. And we worked with the teachers in order to do this exercise that lasted about 2 hours, where they did a little icebreaker, they filled out a little consumption board about what types of species that they eat, and we did a pre-class kind of assessment, and then had somebody do the storytelling and teaching, and then we did a post-test. And so this is kind of what the consumption board looks like. We try to keep things really simple since these kids are really young, but also just in general level of understanding for more advanced concepts sometimes is overcomplicates things in a way where kids can't answer it. So we just kept it really simple and had them keep track of what is it that they eat in the course of a week. And we asked them questions about like what, if they understand like about the forest and what some of these animals are that are very iconic to Sulawesi, and if they knew which one of these were bats, and also just if they understand anything about how bats relate to people, and just also how they understand things about food and just consumption. And we made this poster that was targeted towards these young children after the workshop. And so this is based on not only our research, but also from having talked to folks that are out there. And this is in Bahasa, but also you can see there's English on there. So if anybody wants to reuse it, they are free to do so. And I can send you a copy of it if you're interested. And it teaches people not only about, like I said, durian and bats being a really big part of it, but also how the process actually happens. So how is it that seed dispersal happens from bats, and really getting people to think about each of those steps and what they do being something that affects something further downstream and not just the bats themselves. And the storytelling is a really effective tool to communicate science because of the fact that, these are pretty young kids, and it helps build a connection between bats, forests, and people. And this was a local, this was actually written by our colleague and the co-founder of Progress, Mbak Anim. And she is, she's actually a local government employee. And then she was really interested in doing environmental conservation. So that's why she wanted to co-found Progress and not only target environmental education, but also sustainable development. And the story that she tells in it is something that is very personal to her in a way that shows that, we grew up with the forest and the bats are really like us, and really create this understanding that someone local who really cares about these bats wants other people to also care about these bats and care about the forest in general. And then after we did the storytelling, we did a post-test, which was the same as the pre-test, and then we did a two sampled pair ordinal test. And from that, we found that there were students who, in these 4 classrooms, we found that they actually consumed a lot of different species, but that the flying foxes were the most commonly consumed compared to other wild meats. And our intervention was successful in increasing the understanding about flying foxes as beneficial to the forest. And there was a significant increase also in understanding how bats are beneficial to people. And mostly that's through durian. And students who are eating the bats after the outreach they still have an increased understanding, but it doesn't really change significantly anyway, their bat consumption. And that's something that I'll talk more about in a little bit. So outreach doesn't promote the expected behavior exactly, like preventing kids from eating bats, and there's pretty low bat consumption, but it's higher compared to all the other bushmeat. So we actually need to do better about that, because what we're doing in terms of knowledge transfer is not going to actually lead to the significant change that we want to see in behavior. And that's because a lot of students, they actually don't eat the bats in the entire month because the information that they were given during that time was during a non-holiday time, and so their family didn't eat any bats, and there might have just not been any change that's seen on the graph. So we would need a longer period of time where we actually cross over some of these events a little bit. But that would require the children to remember for longer, which might not be possible. And on top of that, children don't make decisions about what happens at the table at home. So they might not be the ones who are able to decide not to eat bats, even if they don't want to eat it. And they might not have remembered to actually convey the conservation message and what they learned to their parents. And so, or if they did, the parents didn't listen to them. And if that had happened, then there might not be change in the parental behavior also. So we actually need to really target our outreach to include parents, especially having like a children mothers kind of conservation day where we, like I said, involve women more, but also bring them in as authorities of the household so that they can make those decisions. And I just really wanted to use this as a way to point to that awareness raising alone is insufficient. So whenever people suggest to funding agencies, especially those that are larger grants, to only do awareness raising through knowledge transfer and not any other activities like creating policies that help with decreasing hunting or creating roost patrols and things that actually enforce legal regulations around hunting, we will not really see any significant change in behavior. You need to actually combine approaches and activities in order to lead to the behavioral change that you want to see. So in this slide that I showed earlier about how we can address these issues, you will note that all the things I've talked about actually fall into different categories of these things, and we didn't do any of them in isolation. We did them together. So increasing political will, we went out to talk to these village chiefs, and then they also now want to protect bats. We increased enforcement by having patrols that are regular and are able to also monitor the populations. We improved the rule of law because in some of these places there were no regulations about hunting the bats at all, and so we were now putting those in place. And on the demand side, we do not just go out and talk to people about how these bats are important and helping them understand that impact, but also talking about what is it that their behavior is doing to the bats and the rest of the forest and everything else around them. And for us, we're still trying to get a better grasp of why is it that wildlife is consumed. Our understanding for it is pretty much the only study that's been done out there, and there's always more work that can be done in order to get a better understanding of the network. But I think compared to some of the other projects for hunting, we are pretty far along and pretty matured in a way where we can now make better inferences and better decisions about how we do outreach. So none of these things happen in isolation. Like we didn't do just one of them. We actually started with one of them, which was understanding wildlife consumption, and then worked slowly towards all the other ones. And this also highlights the fact that you need to always have somebody who is a local champion in order to help you. You can't just kind of like go in there as a foreigner and think that something is going to work out. So, make friends with people who are nationals of the country that you work in, and have them also work with you as partners in order to do that. For people that are interested in hunting in other places, I talked specifically about Indonesia today, but this is also part of a project that we did as the CB Crew project through Fish and Wildlife. So Sherry, the Cleopaz, is working in the southern Philippines on hunting in flying foxes as a sustenance from a lot of the local people. And the Mabuaya Foundation is the one that's leading the same project for the north part of the Philippines, where they are mostly working in the Sierra Madres. Rimba, which is in Peninsula Malaysia, are working mostly on bat farmer conflict and persecution that comes from bats visiting orchards. And then in India, Pilot Dovi is working on a lot of traditional hunting and harvest in Nagaland. And that's when people consume them also as medicine and these big hunting festivals. And he's particularly interested in their exposure to emerging infectious diseases. Malik works in New Caledonia on traditional hunting, harvest flying foxes, and Tyrone has worked in the Solomon Islands on flying fox teeth as a cultural currency, and they actually use that as a tool to teach people about the cultural value also of the bats. And just as a really quick kind of note in terms of bat hunting and COVID, because that is actually relevant. In Indonesia specifically, there were instances where the local authorities went out and they took bats that they found in the market and they burned them. So the culling that is there, they didn't actively go into the caves and try to find the bats, or go out to the roosts and try to find the bats and then, evict them or burn them. But these are the ones that are already in markets. And then they basically told people you can't sell these bats in these places anymore. But this is in Java. This is not in Sulawesi. And so in Sulawesi, you actually still do see there is consumption and hunting available in the extreme market that I showed you earlier. So some of the photos that people see in Indonesia only reflect a single thing that's happening on one island and not necessarily what's happening all over. And that really points to this need to better understand everything on a decentralized level and not only from one perspective for countries as varied as Indonesia. So see, this photo, for instance, is from Manado, which is in Sulawesi. And so these news reports even are combining things together in ways that are not necessarily true. And so people have to be very careful about that. And in communicating that, I hope that everybody else is careful about how they communicate in their own work. And so if you look recently, there was a paper published by Julie Shapiro and a bunch of other folks from the IUCN Bat Specialist Group about terminology that scientists can use to talk about bats and emerging infectious diseases. And I encourage people to go check that out because it's an open access paper also. And if you can't, be bothered to go out and read that paper, even though it's really helpful, I encourage people to check out the GBATnet blog because we have little short synthesis explainer posts about different things that people have talked about in the past year that are relevant to this question about how the bats relate to the current pandemic. And we are looking at issues about like, why is it that you find lots of viruses in bats or evolutionary origins and things like that. So I think it's something that a lot of people have been asking for because of the fact that it's been very difficult to go through all the literature as things are happening so quickly. And just, in general, as bat scientists, I know a lot of folks want to try to help bats by, having people not cull them and also have better understanding and less misinformation. So, check that resource out if that's the case. And then also just, I would like to acknowledge all these people and funding agencies that helped us in doing my research and also conservation work and me living in Indonesia. And if you are interested in progress and what they've done, then you can check out the link here, which is poniki.id. And also on Instagram, they are Progress Sulawesi. They are now expanding to work not only on flying foxes, but also on other endangered taxa like forest green turtles and other marine taxa that are also in the same area as where we work. So you'll see that there's now not just bat-focused things, but also a slow expansion into other components that are very important to Sulawesi that are not often given any attention. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, for such a great inspirational talk. It's really amazing to see people taking research and understanding of our local situation and applying them to promote on-the-ground conservation and actually managing to make a difference. So really impressive work. I'm opening the floor to questions. So if anyone has a question, please use the chat to ask them and then I'll read them out loud. But while we're waiting for people to think about questions, I had a question myself that I wanted to ask. Maybe it's coming slightly from my bias because I usually work with insectivorous bats. But I was wondering, what is the situation there with insectivorous bats and whether they're hunted as well? And what is the relationship between people and them?
So in our part of Sulawesi, that's not really a common thing. Insect bats are a lot of, in a lot of caves. So there's a lot of karst in Indonesia where there are tons of species, but it's just a lot of effort to catch very small bats. So you don't really see that very often. In Sulawesi, when you have these much larger flying foxes that are really conspicuous. In places like in the Lesser Sundas, for instance, where the flying fox species are not as big, they're slightly smaller, you will see that some people go after other pteropodids that are medium sized, but you don't really see them going after insect bats either. A lot of this is really from the fact that Indonesia has like one of the highest diversities of pteropodids in the world, and Sulawesi is one of those big like pteropodid hotspots. So you see a lot of species that are so much larger that people are just not going to go after these insect bats. It's hard to find those karsts. It's difficult to get to. It's a pain for them to capture like 40 of them and get like no meat, so people just don't go after them in the same way. Though there's like guano harvesting in Indonesia that does disturb insect bats, and you'll see that more often as a problem for them. And that's not just guano harvesting, but also cement companies coming in and destroying some of the caves in order to collect limestone. And that's a bigger problem for the cave bats compared to hunting for flying foxes.
Yeah, thanks for that. And really, I mean, of course, if you have a huge bat versus a much smaller bat, the one that will be hunted is the larger one. And I think the situation is slightly different in, for example, some parts of Africa where you have quite large insectivorous bats that are being hunted as well. We have a few questions here. So we have a question from Kathy saying, do you have information sheet like the durian one for other plants like mango or avocados?
So we didn't make any for like other plants like mango, avocado, especially because those are commercial plants that are not necessarily native to some of the places that we work in. And that's because we are trying to support what we're saying through data that we have collected ourselves, even locally, especially. A lot of villagers don't believe you when you say that the bats are doing so-and-so thing with this plant until you literally show them a picture from the camera trap and you like bring them out there and show the bats doing it in the tree. So it works better when we can have a direct example. And durian also just has a lot higher cultural value in a way that creates this emotional reaction from people. And so it's easier to get people to then support bat conservation from that. With mangoes and avocados, they're economically important in a different way. And they are not really as culturally tied to people. So you could potentially get the government's attention in terms of agroforestry. But one, we don't have the data for that. And two, it wouldn't cause the same type of visceral reaction in local communities in order to do something about it.
I suppose in terms of really thinking about, if people are thinking about trying to start these kind of projects in other countries, is to identify first that hook. So that
yes.
type of crop that's really not just economically important, but also culturally important.
Yeah, and one thing I didn't mention in this talk, but was also part of Sarah's master's thesis, is that when we collected the bats, we swabbed them for the pollen. So we did identify, and that's how we know that they're ecologically important plants also involved, is that we swabbed them and identified the pollen. And so we know there's a lot of fig species involved, for instance, and that when there is a chance to, the bats generally, Acerodon generally prefers the native species, whereas Trochus electo is willing to be more of a generalist. And so there are differences in how the flying foxes are also associating with the plants. But at the same time, like you want to, when you're communicating with the public, you want to go for like straightforward, simple messages. And so, you know, while that is in our paper, which you can read, all of my papers open access, you will need to actually think clearly about what is it that will actually connect with the public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good point there. And we have some questions and comments. So Ellis said, amazing talk, and Dave said, really interesting, and that's such a worthwhile work. Then we have Eleanor as well said, super talk. I enjoyed listening to the well thought out solution to the problem. So we have some questions as well. So Marie's asked, are you planning on extended follow-up to promote increased conservation?
So we are actually still working on that. Progress is not only now our little local initiative, but it's been officially, made into an NGO now. And so it's registered to the Indonesian government. We are in the process of formalizing their website a little bit more so that if people wanted to donate to them, they can. The donation process used to be people would give me the money to give to them. And so you can now just give the money directly to them once they finish setting that up. At the same time, also, Sarah is going to be doing her PhD, hopefully starting next year. And so, we will still continue to improve on how they can more effectively work environmental policy into some of that conservation work and create more effective change in Sulawesi.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, this is the kind of thing that once you start it, if you can maintain it for a long time, this is where you really get progress and change. There's another question for Marie asking, is there any medical information supporting improvement in asthma by eating bats? Any information providing it is a myth?
So there is no medical, evidence at all that it improves anything in people. The reason why people eat the bats, so they specifically eat the liver. And the reason for that is because culturally, the liver was kind of considered like the center of the body and not like the heart or the brain or anything else. And so people eat the liver because they think it's the thing that keeps the bats healthy. And when you talk to people about why they eat them, and especially for things like asthma, they'll say, well, the bats are out there eating these fruits and they seem very healthy. So if I eat this, then I will also be very healthy. In which case, the logical thing is, why don't you just eat the fruits instead? But, people eat the bats because they think that that's what helps them. And there's no evidence for that. It's just literally like it's a belief centralized on very specific ways of thinking about physiology and how they're important to people. So yeah, there's nothing that ever shows that. And that's true of a lot of places where people have very localized superstitions. And there are actually a lot of very localized superstitions in Indonesia that are not always consistent throughout the entire country also. Because you have to remember there are hundreds of ethnic groups and they are different according to island even. And so a lot of the only times when you see shared cultural beliefs, it's because Javanese people were transmigrated to other islands and not because that was like a local tradition necessarily. And so understanding those differences is really important, also to just how groups relate to one another and where friction exists, and that might be causing some of those conservation issues also.
Thanks for that. I'm wondering if anyone has got any more questions, so please put them in the chat. In the meanwhile, I had a little question to ask, and that was related to what you mentioned about environmental education, which is obviously the focus of a lot of outreach work, but you mentioned also how perhaps that's not the only route forward, and you need to actually combine it with a bit more legal type of enforcement. I was wondering, how easy did you find to push this at the policy level or on government front to actually have the legal basis to be able to protect bats?
So we started from something very small. So we started at the village community level. It was only after getting stronger support and actually formalizing it and then showing that it worked in the villages in order to decrease hunting that we were able to then go to a higher level and have them sign an MOU with Progress in order to commit to that. And that's difficult to do if you don't have somebody who is there locally helping to lobby for things like this. And when I say also that like education alone is insufficient, it doesn't always have to be a policy thing that goes with it. It can be something like having the roost patrols, for instance, because sometimes it is not possible to change local laws and regulations necessarily. But if you had something that was enforcing existing laws or even just enforcing no takes from natural environments, then it's a way for you to support what you're saying in terms of don't hunt the bats. This is important, and this is something that people need to pay more attention to. That I say this as a not just like a conservation biologist, but also having sat on the other side of a funding agency's table where you're making these decisions. Where through the decades of experience of my colleagues at Fish and Wildlife, and also through understanding how projects have worked, a lot of times while building that educational awareness is extremely important to getting support and building in that. If you only do that, the outcome that you want to see might not happen. So you need to do something else that supports precisely the outcome that you want to see. And a good example for this is that, if we didn't support doing things like law enforcement and pushing for these anti-hunting bans, but we actually did an intervention that focused more on like protecting the mangroves and something like that, you might actually end up with regulations that are more habitat focused for something and not bat specific. And that might be because of the fact that somebody just didn't like bats enough and they said they wanted to protect an entire habitat. So you end up picking whatever it is that you do with your education as something that is relevant to something that you want to buy into, and also something that would actually target your end objective.
Yeah, really interesting to hear it, and actually to get this kind of knowledge from somebody who has tried to do it and has gone through it and knows what has worked and what perhaps needs to be combined with what to get it to work. And I think this is something that's really relevant perhaps for a lot of people listening here as well, that are thinking, how can I start this kind of project where I live and how can I influence change over there? So yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I really like the concept of following these type of theories of change and how to really change people's attitudes, and that perhaps some of it can be through education, but some has to be in other means as well. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, what's the next step for you in terms of flying fox conservation?
So for us, with work in progress specifically, we are starting to do environmental education in more places and also distributing some of those materials further along in other places in Sulawesi. So working now with communities that are on the supply side in order to help them be able to protect their roosts also. And not just in our little area, but also in those bigger colonies that are being hunted in South Sulawesi. And then helping them, again, like raise the level of that regulation, not just from our little regency level, but slowly building to provincial and hopefully wider. And part of the reason why it's also easier sometimes to get at these bats is because bats are kind of like an easy, it's not very controversial in terms of being able to protect the bats compared to something like a tiger, right? And so it's a little easier to convince people because it's an easy conservation win for a lot of offices that are looking for achievements, basically. And so sometimes you can talk to people about that and they understand and have a really easy kind of simple thing to say, oh, if we protect this, here's all the downstream impacts and it makes me look good as a politician. And so they are happy to support it. And that you see is also effective on getting support for things even on an international scale. So you just have to know where to pick your battles and who to pick them with. And so again, that's a better understanding of not just the local system, but the general political system. And that may speak to the fact that I'm very much a person who supports multidisciplinary research, but also multidisciplinary understanding of people that you're working with, because otherwise you're not going to be able to do anything that is going to have a long-term outcome. It's always going to end up being something that's very short, and it will end when the project leaves. And we don't want that to happen, because we have finite resources. And so, find somebody local who is a champion, who will help also, and work closely with them in order to build that is extremely important.
That's so true, indeed. We have one last question from Marie before we finish, asking, how can we have access to those great posters for educational purposes?
So what I can do, I can point you to Progress's website where some of those materials are already on there. And I can also, I'll link them again, and everybody can circulate that around later. But I can also, if you have problems with accessing for whatever reason, I can point you towards their Instagram, because also there's stuff on their Instagram. And I can always send them to you directly if you're having trouble accessing them in any other way.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And what we can do also is when we upload this to the YouTube channel, then we can also add the links, and that will probably be an easy way for people to be able to download that. Okay, so I wanted to thank you again, Susan, for such a great inspirational talk, and really fair play for the amazing work you're doing, and hopefully you'll really be able to continue doing the kind of changes that you've managed to do, and even more changes. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to just finish by sharing the link if anyone wanted to donate to Bats Without Borders to help support these kind of webinars.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. And I would like to again acknowledge that a lot of this work was from Sarah and her master's research and working with Anim at Progress. And so they are some of the true champions on the ground, and hopefully like 5 years down the line, Sarah's the one who's talking about this and not me. So look forward to that when that happens.
Well, if these seminars are still going on, we'll definitely invite her. Okay, brilliant. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye.